This is our painting for today. It's a Bromeliad, plentiful here in Florida, and they come in so many different varieties that it's difficult to choose what to paint sometimes. This one has been done in a limited palette as far as the colors are concerned, maybe 5 or 6 colors for the entire painting. And there will be a reference photo for those colors sent out. And here is the line drawing. I recommend that with a line drawing, you erase the surface graphite first. It will dull down your yellows. So I use a dry eraser, a bag eraser. This one is well used, as you can tell. Lightly rub over the surface of your drawing, and it will remove any excess graphite that you might have on your paper. It's very important to do that when painting with yellows. If you leave it on there, so it's really important to get that off. We are going to begin painting one of these smaller flower petals. I find that it's easier to warm up, if you will, by starting a smaller petal and working your way into the large wet by wet petals. It gives you a little bit of practice and a little bit of blending in the colors. We're going to begin with a cobalt blue. You can use any brand you like, and that's going to be mixed on the paper with opera. Again, any brand that you like. They're very, very similar across the board. So I'm going to start with this particular petal right here, and I think that's a good one in the background in which to do. I will put the going to put the opera on first. If you want to wet the petals first, if you're not comfortable or if you're a beginner and you would like to make it a little bit easier painting process, I'll go ahead and wet this one just to give you an idea of how the paint dilutes when you use a wet and wet technique. So I will paint this with water, just like if I were going to paint it with paint. The paint will only run where the water is, so you don't have to worry about anything outside of that. I've left the lines rather defined so that it's easier on camera here to see where we are. So this is very, very shiny wet. I'm going to lift a little bit of excess water with my brush. I don't want the colors diluted that much. I am using a 1/4 inch dagger brush by King Art. It's a wonderful brush. It takes the place of a flat and also a very round pointed brush as well. It's very easy to work with. I will do the entire painting with this one brush. It eliminates having to change brushes and rinsing and colors and that sort of thing. Now that the water is settled into the paper a little bit, I will go ahead first and put the opera down. We'll be using permanent rose later, but we will be blending this one with cobalt. So I want to use opera for that. I find it makes a much nicer purple. If you want to use permanent rose and you don't have opera, absolutely you can do that. So we're just going to paint this this along the edge. I'm bringing this down into the entire flower, this petal, because I'm going to turn that end purple, and I'm going to do that by adding a little bit of cobalt blue. And we will add the cobalt here over the top and blend it down into the pink. I don't want a hard line here. I would like to get that transition rather smooth. This is a little stronger than I would normally paint it, but we do have a wet surface we're painting on, and so it will lighten somewhat. So I'm just going to bring it down here, give it a little bit of interest with a couple of striations down into the base of this flower here. If you want to revisit this and you feel as if you need to add a little more color later, if it's too light and you haven't added enough paint, you can easily do that. Go in with this dagger brush. I'm going to clean these edges up just a little bit. And that petal is done. If you have anything outside of this particular petal that you feel isn't straight, the background that goes in here is extremely dark, and you can clean that edge up when you put your background in. While we're working in these colors, let's go ahead and paint this small petal here next to it. This one I won't wet because it's relatively small and I don't think anybody will have any issue. So I will just go in with the opera, paint the entire petal. Get some paint on your brush, it always helps. And I'll go in and paint this whole thing with opera. If you find it's too strong or you'd like a little highlight on your petal, I go ahead and use a little bit of tissue paper for lifting that, but I don't think it's necessary here. I will show you that technique later on. I'm going to go ahead and add the blue now. It won't take much, just a little bit on the end. We don't want to lose all of that pink we've got going on here. So it's fairly easy. The small ones are fairly easy if you're relatively new with this. And we will then go on with just the tip of this one. As long as we're dealing in this paint, I'm going to add just a little bit of cad yellow in here. I'm going to put the pink in, and then I'm going to put the blue on the end. And I'm doing it just to vary this a little bit. I'm going to paint this. This happens to be a shadow. This little section here is a shadow actually on this leaf. I'm going to paint that. We will cover that up later with a little darker color. But for right now, we'll just go in. Again, you can wet this first. I'm going in with just paint. If it's easier, wet it. I find that for beginners, it's much easier to wet it first. They tend to get a smoother transition. I'm going to drop the opera in here, paint the opera to the end where we want that little bit of purple going around this small flower here. Those will be painted, the center of the flower will be painted in a kind of a pale green because that's new buds. We'll bring this pink down into the yellow. I'm looking for that transition of color. So that gives us a nice color transition there with the yellow and the permanent rose. Permanent rose goes well with so many different colors and it blends very well. Now I'm going to add the cobalt, keeping in mind that this particular flower right here that has this little point on it, we're going to want that in a different color. So I'm going to go around this one with the blue so that we have a contrast between this and this flower here. And you can bring that down as far as you want. I just don't want to bring it down into the yellow because I'm not looking for green at this point. So it's something to always be aware of. And that petal is also finished. We're going to swing over here to this particular part of the painting right now. I want to introduce the cadmium yellow into this particular petal. I will put, we're also going to switch to permanent rose. We don't have to, you could still use the opera if you wish, but I have to start pulling the permanent rose in, and it's going to be on either side of that petal. It's a very similar color. The opera is just a little bit brighter and makes a better purple than the permanent rose does. And I will wet this petal just due to the size of it. Some of you may have a problem blending smoothly. into an area this large. And that's why we practiced, if you will, on those other smaller areas. So I will wet this. It does make for an easier transition, and it is easier to paint. So we're going to paint just like we had paint on our brush. This time with the permanent rose, coming down both sides of the flower. I'm using, I think, Mission paints. I'm very fond of Mission paints. They're very bright, and they also dry basically in the color that you see them while they're wet. When they're dry, there's not much variance. I'm going to clean this edge up a bit. This would also be a continuation. I can do that when this one is done. The important thing is, while these are wet, you want to get these done first. I'm also going to come in here. This will be a little bit darker here. And a little bit lighter here on top. I'm going to paint this down both sides. I am going to put a little bit of purple in here by adding cobalt blue, but I do want to start introducing the cadmium yellow. It's a brilliant yellow. It won't fade. It'll stand up against some other colors. I don't want to bring it to the end because that is where we're going to put the blue, and I really don't want green at this point. So I'm going to add a little bit more paint. We don't have quite enough paint here. If you overlap your colors, that's fine. You just don't want to paint over them so that you lose this translucency of watercolor. Now when I get to a gouache tutorial, that's a different story, but that's a painting for another day. Little bit of permanent rose here to add that blue. Just going to introduce that here. Trying to avoid the yellow as much as possible. You can still work your painting while it's live, meaning it's still wet and shiny. You can introduce colors. Just tend not to do this because it's better to come from the edge and blend in so that you don't have a mark like this one on your painting. Let me get that out of there. Every time I demo something not to do, I have to go back and fix it. So now we have a nice little highlight of yellow, and we can start to pull that into our painting just a bit. I'm going to add just a little bit more as a detail on this flower. Wipe your brush in between colors. You see I transferred a little bit of pink there. Wipe your brush in between colors or they will mix. So there's a nice little highlight on that petal, and we're going to leave that one. That one is also finished. We're now going to paint one of the larger petals. This one is behind some of the others. It's going to be darker. The reference painting, you will see it's kind of a brown. I put a burnt sienna with it. We're not going to use that today. It's going to be done in a pink. We're going to maintain these colors that we have going to make the painting cohesive. And this one I'm going to wet first and drop that in. It's going to be done a little darker. We may come back and do this one with another wash. I want the petal up in this area to be rather dark. We need some contrast and value change between the petals above it. So we're going to start with permanent rose. If you don't want this quite that colorful, and I take care here, this is a turned portion of this particular leaf. I do not want to lose that edge that's drawn in. So I'm going to carefully paint that edge and this one. We will come down here like so. Go ahead and bring our pink down. I'm going to also add just a little bit of yellow to this. Cadmium yellow really holds up. I've been using a permanent yellow, but trying the CADs. CAD's got a bad reputation with oil paints because of the carcinogenic elements in that paint. But I don't think we're all going to die from just doing a little watercolor with a touch of cadmium yellow. I probably need to look that up at some point and check the watercolors for that particular color to see what they have to say. Again, more paint. This is a darker leaf. This is permanent rose again. Working out of a relatively small palette too, which I like to do. I'm not one for mixing in a large palette with a large area, although some people are very comfortable with doing that. So if that's what you like to do, I would say just make your painting palette in a way that makes you comfortable to paint, because if you aren't, then it's just going to be more difficult, and it's also discouraging for people starting out and also experienced painters. It's your painting and your technique. I'm just showing you how I do mine. But if you have a better way, or it's more comfortable for you, you should do it the way that it's actually easier for you. It is your painting. Adding a bit of blue. We're going to have this blue in contrast with this green here. I'm just going to smooth this out with this dagger brush. And I will give it probably a second wash up in here to make it a little bit darker as it dries. So this one we're going to give an evaluation to a little bit later and see how we like it. But I do have a little bit of a wonky edge here, so I'm going to come in with this dagger brush, clean that edge up a little bit. It's fairly easy to do. Turn the brush over, you've got a super sharp point, and it's very easy to get into all sorts of areas and to make fine little points to any portion of your painting. So we're going to call that done for right now. If you want to darken that, sometimes I'll add a green up in there, but I'm going to wait until this dries completely because it's now at the stage where I'm going to get blossoms, and I don't want a blossom in this one. I'm just going to go in and smooth this blue out just a tad. I can see my line here. I'll clean that up a little bit later. As this leaf comes up in here, this is a dark green leaf, I can then go ahead and paint it just over this edge and take that out.